If you could trade the scraps from your table for a miracle, would you dare? The question came from a voice so small it was almost lost in the howl of the winter wind. Yet for Anthony Whitmore, it pierced the silence of his mansion like a shard of glass. 54 years old, a self-made millionaire, Anthony had once ruled boardrooms with an iron will. Now he sat in a custom-made wheelchair, staring through the frost-covered glass of his sprawling estate. Outside, thick snow fell under the pale glow of the street lamps, turning the world into a frozen canvas. Inside, the vast room stood silent. No footsteps, no voices, only the faint hum of the central heating. It had been 21 years since the car accident that had stolen his ability to walk. 21 years since friends stopped calling, since investors moved on, and since Claire, his wife, had quietly walked out of his life. The world had not merely abandoned him, it had erased him. That night, Anthony's gaze was as cold as the snow outside, his mind drifting back to the days when power came as easily as breathing. Now even the priceless art on his walls felt like cruel reminders of a man he used to be. Then came the sound, a soft, hesitant knock at the servant's door. At first he thought he imagined it. Who could possibly come here, at this hour, in this storm? The knocking persisted, not loud, not desperate, but steady, as if whoever stood there knew he would answer. Wheeling himself through the dim corridor, Anthony opened the door. And there she was. A tiny girl, no more than 6, stood shivering under the weak porch light. Her coat was torn, shoes worn through to the skin. Dark curls clung to her forehead, dusted with snowflakes. But it was her eyes, wide, unflinching, and impossibly bright, that held him. "Mister," she said softly, "I'm hungry. Do you have any leftovers?" Anthony froze. No one had spoken to him with such simple honesty in years. People looked at him and saw either his money or his wheelchair, not the man in between. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "Lila Carter," she replied, lifting her chin, as if the cold could not touch her pride. And then, with a confidence that startled him, she added, "If you give me food, I can help you walk again." For a heartbeat, Anthony thought she was mocking him. But there was no hint of jest in her gaze, only certainty. And somewhere deep inside, a place he thought was frozen solid began to stir. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, without even knowing it, Anthony had opened more than just his door. He had opened the first crack in the walls he had built around his heart. Anthony hesitated, still holding the door open as a sharp wind pushed snow into the hallway. Something in Lila's small, steady voice unsettled him. Not in a way that felt dangerous, but in a way that scraped against the numbness he had carried for years. "Come in," he finally said, pulling the door wider. She stepped inside carefully, her eyes darting around the grand foyer. Marble floors, towering chandeliers, polished wood. Yet she didn't gape the way most visitors did. She simply observed, curious but unawed. In the kitchen, Anthony retrieved a platter of untouched food from the refrigerator. He set it in front of her. She murmured a quiet thank you but didn't eat right away. Instead, she looked at him with a calm seriousness far beyond her age. "Do you believe in miracles?" she asked. Anthony almost laughed. "Not anymore." "Then that's why you can't walk," she replied simply, as if explaining why the sky was blue. He studied her, unsure if she was naive or simply fearless. "And you can fix that?" "I can try," she said, her voice carrying no arrogance, only certainty. "Mama says love and faith can heal anything. If you help me, I'll help you." Her words stirred an uncomfortable heat in his chest. For years, he had endured every experimental treatment, every promising therapy. None of it worked. And here was a child promising what the world's most expensive doctors could not. "Where's your mother?" he asked, shifting the conversation. "She works nights." "Across the street in the old apartments," Lila said, pointing toward the dark row of buildings barely visible through the snow. Anthony's gaze followed, realizing he had lived across from that block for over a decade and never truly looked at it. Guilt flickered through him. "Why didn't you wait for her to come home? She's tired. Some nights she doesn't get back until morning. And Mrs. Patterson said rich people throw away food that's still good. So, I came to ask you." The honesty in her tone caught him off guard. No shame, no manipulation. Just truth. After a pause, Anthony asked, "And what exactly would you do to make me walk?" Lila pushed her plate aside and slid off her chair. "May I touch your knee?" It was such an absurd request that he almost refused, but her eyes were unwavering. Slowly he nodded. Her small hand rested gently against his leg. He felt nothing where her fingers touched, but deeper, somewhere near his chest, there was a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Sending love," she answered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Because you look like you've forgotten what it feels like?" The words slipped past every wall he had built. Anthony didn't know whether to feel foolish or hopeful. When she finally picked up her fork, the silence between them was no longer cold. It felt alive, waiting for something neither could name. As she ate, Anthony realized he was watching her more than his own thoughts. And when she finished and stood to leave, he found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "Come back tomorrow." She smiled, the kind of smile that left a mark. "I will. We have a miracle to start." And just like that, the door closed behind her, but the warmth remained. The next morning, Anthony found himself glancing toward the front gate more often than he cared to admit. It was absurd. He was a man who once negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, yet now he was waiting for a 6-year-old girl. By late afternoon, a knock echoed at the door. When he opened it, Lila stood there holding something wrapped in old newspaper. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her eyes shone as brightly as before. "I came to say thank you," she said, handing him the bundle. Inside was a single small flower, its petals slightly wilted but still beautiful. "This is the miracle of gratitude. Mama says every gift, even a tiny one, carries magic." Anthony felt a lump in his throat. No one had brought him a gift in years, certainly not something so personal. But before he could respond, a shadow appeared behind Lila. A tall, slender woman approached, her coat worn but clean, her posture straight as steel. Her eyes, however, were sharp with suspicion. "You must be Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone steady but edged with tension. "I'm Rachel Carter, Lila's mother. I want to know exactly what happened here last night." Anthony invited her inside, explaining about the leftovers, the conversation, and Lila's strange promise. But the more he spoke, the more Rachel's expression hardened. "Do you know what people say about wealthy men and poor girls?" she asked quietly, but with a heat that could burn. "Do you understand the fear I felt when my daughter came home, saying she'd been in a stranger's mansion after dark?" Anthony met her gaze without flinching. "I understand your fear, but I assure you, your daughter is the first person in years to make me feel human again. I had no ill intentions." Rachel studied him for a long moment. She didn't see pity in his eyes. She didn't see greed. She saw loneliness. Yet her guard remained. "If you truly mean that, then I'll set conditions," she said firmly. "If Lila is ever to visit again, I'll come with her. I need to see this place for myself before I decide whether it's safe." Anthony nodded without hesitation. "You're both welcome here. If I ever give you a reason to doubt me, tell me, and I'll make it right." The tension in Rachel's shoulders eased slightly, but her eyes stayed wary. "I'll hold you to that." When they left, Anthony returned to the living room, the small flower still in his hand. He realized the mansion felt different now. Not warmer exactly, but less empty. That night, he sat by the window long after the snow stopped falling. He didn't know if Lila's miracle was possible, but he knew one thing for certain. The walls he had built around himself had begun to crack, and through those cracks, the faintest light was starting to get in. 2 evenings later, Rachel kept her word. She and Lila stood at the tall iron gate of the Whitmore estate, the bitter wind snapping at their coats. Lila's small hand gripped her mother's tightly, her eyes bright with excitement despite the cold. Rachel's heart beat faster, though not from the weather. She had spent years navigating a world that measured worth by skin color and bank accounts. Stepping into a millionaire's home as something other than hired help felt like crossing into forbidden territory. As they approached the front steps, a low hum broke the stillness, a sleek black car rolling up to the curb. The tinted window slid down to reveal Margaret Ellison, a neighbor draped in furs and diamonds. She gave them a slow, cutting glance. "Well," she said loudly enough for passers-by to hear, "looks like Mr. Whitmore's charity work has expanded to house calls." The smirk that followed was as sharp as broken glass. Rachel felt Lila tense beside her. Around them, other neighbors slowed their pace. One man in a tailored coat whispered to his wife. A woman in pearls shook her head with thin-lipped disapproval. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Rachel fought to keep her chin high. She had learned long ago that if she let one crack show, the world would take a hammer to it. The mansion door opened before she could knock. Anthony was there, framed by the warm glow of the foyer. His face softened when he saw them, and for a moment, the noise outside faded. "Come in," he said warmly, stepping back to let them through. The living room had been prepared with meticulous care. Fresh logs crackled in the fireplace. The armchairs were pulled closer together, and on the low table sat a pot of tea and a plate of warm pastries. It wasn't extravagance. It was welcome. Rachel hesitated, scanning the room as if searching for the trap she had been taught to expect. But there was none. "I'm glad you came," Anthony said, his gaze moving between them. "Lila told me you work nights. That can't be easy." Rachel allowed herself a faint smile. "Easy doesn't keep the lights on, but we manage." Meanwhile, Lila was already wandering the room, fingers trailing lightly along the spines of books and the edges of picture frames. "Mama," she whispered when she came back, "Mr. Anthony's house isn't lonely today. I think it's because we're here." Rachel's throat tightened at her daughter's words. Anthony poured tea for them both. "This house has been quiet for too long. I'd like to change that," he said. "I've been looking for a housekeeper, but what I really need is company. Someone who isn't afraid to be honest with me." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think that someone is us?" "I think," Anthony said, "that Lila has already given me something worth more than money. She made me believe again. And I'd like to offer you both a place here, safe, warm, and yours for as long as you choose." Rachel's first instinct was to refuse. She could hear the neighbors' whispers even now, see the headlines that could twist this into something ugly. But she also saw Lila's face, alight with hope she hadn't worn in years. "If I were to say yes," Rachel began slowly, "there would be conditions. Lila's needs come first. I help with the household. We're not freeloaders. And if the day comes when you want us gone, you tell me directly, and we leave with our dignity." Anthony nodded, his expression earnest. "Agreed." For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Outside, the world could keep its whispers. Inside this room, the rules were changing. The first week inside the Whitmore mansion was different. Rachel woke before dawn, brewing coffee and organizing the kitchen the way she'd done in every job she ever held. But this time she wasn't an employee. Lila's laughter spilled down the grand hallway each morning, her small footsteps echoing through spaces that had been silent for decades. Anthony, for his part, seemed to breathe a little easier with them there. But beyond the high brick walls, the world was not so welcoming. It started with glances, neighbors slowing their walks to stare at the two strangers coming and going from the estate. Then came the letters, shoved under the gate. Anonymous messages scrawled in uneven ink. "They'll bleed you dry. Be careful who you let in." Some didn't bother with subtlety. "Go back where you belong." Rachel tore them up before Lila could see. Anthony, however, insisted on reading them. "They're just paper," he said, tossing the scraps into the fireplace. "What matters is what we choose to believe." Still, the murmurs grew. At the country club, Anthony's old acquaintances speculated over cocktails. Poor Whitmore, losing his mind over a sob story. At the market, whispers followed Rachel down the aisle. Lila noticed. "Mama," she asked one afternoon, "why do people look at us like we don't belong here?" Rachel's throat tightened. "Because they don't know us yet," she said softly. The tension reached its breaking point on a Saturday morning. Anthony was in the living room, guiding Lila through a drawing exercise when the security monitor flashed. A woman in a long camel-colored coat, her posture regal and uncompromising, stood at the front gate. Her silver hair gleamed against the winter sun. Anthony's chest tightened. Mother. Eleanor Whitmore had not set foot in her son's home in over a year. She swept inside with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on Rachel, who was setting out fresh scones in the kitchen. Mother, Anthony began, this is Rachel, and you've met her daughter, Lila. Eleanor didn't even glance at Rachel. Instead, her gaze locked on Anthony. What exactly is going on here? You've let strangers live in this house. Different class, different background, different color. Do you think your father would approve? The words landed like a slap. Rachel's hands froze on the tray. Lila edged closer to her mother. Anthony's voice was low but firm. They're not strangers. They're family to me now. Family? Eleanor's voice sharpened. You've grown weak, Anthony. You've let sentiment cloud your judgment. These people... Rachel turned, her eyes steady. These people? You mean me and my daughter. I come as a mother who works hard for her child. I haven't taken a penny from your son. I keep this home in order. And my daughter, she's given him back something no doctor could... hope. Eleanor hesitated, caught off guard by Rachel's calm strength. If you can't see past the way we look, Rachel continued, at least look at your son. Is he happier now, or before we came? Silence hung heavy in the air. Lila's small hand tightened around her mother's skirt. Anthony glanced between them, then drew a deep breath. Mother, he said evenly, I don't need your approval. But I won't let you or anyone insult the people who've brought life back into this house. This is my home. They stay. For a long moment, Eleanor stood frozen, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and left. When the door closed, the three of them sat in the quiet, the air thick with what had just been said. The world outside was still hostile, but inside these walls a line had been drawn. The days after Eleanor's confrontation felt quieter on the surface. Rachel moved through her routines with measured calm, but her ears stayed sharp for the creak of the gate, the knock at the door, the sound of whispers just beyond the walls. Lila's laughter still danced through the halls, but now it carried a faint tremor, as if the child had begun to sense the undercurrent of unease. Anthony kept his promise, never letting an insult go unchallenged inside his home. Yet in the stillness between conversations, Rachel often caught him staring at the snow-covered gardens, his hands tightening on the wheels of his chair, as though fighting an old invisible weight. One morning, as Rachel carried fresh linens to the storage room, she heard a voice from the back garden. Low, urgent. She froze. It was Sophia. The housekeeper had been with the Whitmore family for nearly 3 decades, long before Rachel knew Anthony's name. She had been there through his reckless youth, his meteoric rise, and the dark years after the accident. To outsiders, she was a fixture in the Whitmore household. To Rachel, she was polite, but distant. Now, hidden behind the half-closed door, Rachel heard words that made her stomach twist. She's not what she seems, Diana, Sophia was saying into her phone. First it was leftovers, then she's managing the kitchen, and now she's in the master's confidence. Don't worry, I'll keep feeding your lawyer what you need. These people shouldn't stay long. The Whitmore legacy doesn't belong in the hands of outsiders. Rachel's breath caught. Outsiders. The word was cold, deliberate, and drenched in the same prejudice she had spent her life confronting. When Sophia ended the call, Rachel stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but it trembled with fury. How long have you been doing this? Sophia turned, feigning surprise. Doing what? Lying. Spreading stories to the one person who wants us gone more than anyone. Anthony's ex-wife. You think I wouldn't find out? Sophia's expression hardened. I'm protecting this family. He's too kind for his own good. And you. Her gaze swept over Rachel like a blade. You don't belong here. This house isn't a charity. Rachel's hands clenched, but she refused to look away. I've never touched a thing that wasn't mine. I've done nothing but keep this home and protect my daughter. The only person poisoning this place is you. The sharp rhythm of wheels on marble cut through the air. Anthony appeared in the doorway, his eyes flicking between them. What's going on? Rachel swallowed. Sophia's been working with Diana, feeding her lies to use in court. Not to protect you, but because she hates that we're here." Sophia straightened, her voice suddenly defensive. "I'm looking out for you, Anthony. I've been here for you longer than anyone. Can't you see? She'll take everything." Anthony was silent for a long moment. This was the woman who had cared for him through the worst days of his life. But as he looked at Rachel's steady gaze and remembered the words, "Outsiders shouldn't stay long," something inside him shifted. "Sophia," he said at last, his tone low but unyielding, "you've served this family for years, and I thank you for it. But prejudice has no place in my home. Not anymore. If you can't accept that, I can't keep you here." The words seemed to strip the room bare. Sophia's eyes filled, not with regret, but with wounded pride. Without another word, she left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing into the distance. That night, Anthony sat by the window long after the lights went out, the loss heavy in his chest. But for the first time in years, his choice was clear. This house would be built on truth, or it wouldn't stand at all. Sophia's departure left the mansion unnervingly still. For years, her footsteps had been as much a part of the house as the creak of the grand staircase, or the soft hum of the boiler. Now the silence felt different, heavier, almost expectant. Rachel sensed it too. She moved through the rooms like someone aware of being watched, her mind replaying every word she'd overheard in the garden. She didn't need to guess where Sophia's information would land. It didn't take long to find out. 3 days later, Anthony sat at the breakfast table when a thick envelope arrived, delivered by hand. Inside was a legal summons, the ink crisp, the language cold. His ex-wife, Diana Whitmore, was petitioning the court to freeze his assets and remove Rachel and Lila from the estate. The claim, emotional manipulation, undue influence, and the exploitation of a vulnerable man. Rachel read it twice, her jaw tightening with each line. "This is Sophia's work," she said quietly. Anthony set the papers down with deliberate care. "It's more than that. Diana's been looking for a way back into this house since the day she left. Now she has her excuse." News of the lawsuit broke within hours. By evening, the tabloids had already spun their version, "Paralyzed Millionaire Ensnared" by mysterious mother and child. They dug into Rachel's past, twisting her years of honest work into a narrative of calculated ambition. They reduced Lila to a pawn, a child trained to charm her way into a fortune. The phone rang nonstop, reporters demanding comment, old acquaintances calling to offer veiled advice laced with suspicion. Lila, sensing her mother's distress, asked softly, "Mama, is it because of us that people are saying mean things about Mr. Anthony?" Rachel knelt, holding her daughter's face between her hands. "It's because some people don't understand us yet, but we'll help them see the truth." Anthony, hearing her words, knew he couldn't let the storm tear them apart. "We'll fight this," he said, "all of us, together." The first court hearing was a spectacle. Diana arrived draped in designer black, flanked by 3 lawyers and a trail of photographers. Her eyes swept over the courtroom like she was inspecting her property. On the other side, Anthony sat beside Rachel and Lila. His mother, Eleanor, was there too, her expression unreadable, but her presence unshakable. Diana's lawyer wasted no time, parading Sophia's statements as if they were gospel. He painted Rachel as an opportunist, implying she'd orchestrated every moment since that night Lila knocked on the door. He questioned Anthony's mental clarity, suggesting his recovery, if real, was a manipulation tactic. Rachel felt her pulse hammering, but she held her composure. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Then the lawyer made a calculated move. "We request that the child, Lila Carter, be called to the stand." A ripple of murmurs swept the room. Rachel's hand tightened around her daughter's. "You don't have to," she whispered, but Lila nodded. "I want to." The courtroom quieted as the small girl climbed into the witness chair. She swung her legs slightly, then looked straight at the judge. "They say my mom and I did something bad," she began, her voice steady. "But we didn't. We help Mr. Anthony every day. I bring him flowers. I try to help him walk again. He used to be sad, but now he smiles. That's all we do. We make each other happy." The words were so simple, so uncalculated, that for a moment the entire room seemed to forget why they were there. Even the court reporter paused her typing. Anthony watched, his chest tightening with pride. He knew, right then, that the tide had begun to turn. The hearing adjourned with no decision yet, but something had shifted. The whispers outside the courthouse sounded softer. For the first time since the lawsuit began, Anthony felt they might just win. The second hearing drew even more attention than the first. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Anthony's wheelchair rolled through the double doors. Rachel walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. Eleanor followed close behind, her expression a careful mask. Inside, the air was taut with expectation. Diana's legal team wore confident smirks, as if the outcome had already been decided. But today, Anthony had come prepared. The judge called the first witness, Dr. Emily Harrow, a neurologist who had followed Anthony's case for years. She had been skeptical from the start, but after recent examinations, her tone had shifted. At first, Dr. Harrow testified, I believed any reported improvement was psychological, perhaps even the result of suggestion. But our latest scans show undeniable signs of neural reconnection in Mr. Whitmore's lower spine. This is not a placebo effect. It is genuine medical progress. The opposing lawyer leaned forward. And do you attribute this to the influence of Ms. Carter or her daughter? I can't speak to personal influence, Dr. Harrow replied, but I can say that emotional stability, human connection, and renewed purpose can drastically affect a patient's physical recovery. I've seen nothing in my career quite like this case. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge turned to Anthony. Mr. Whitmore, would you be willing to demonstrate your current mobility? The room went still. Rachel's breath caught. Lila clasped her hands together, whispering, You can do it, Mr. Anthony. Anthony took a slow breath and gripped the arms of his chair. For 21 years, he had dreamed of this moment, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for himself. His muscles trembled as he shifted his weight. The first motion was small, almost imperceptible. Then his body rose. Gasps erupted. He stood. The judge's eyes widened, but the room remained silent as Anthony, aided by a cane, took one step. Then another. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, like he was reclaiming the ground beneath his feet. When he reached the witness stand, he turned toward the judge. This isn't the result of manipulation. This is the result of hope. Something I thought I'd lost forever until Rachel and Lila walked into my life. Even the court stenographer hesitated, her fingers frozen over the keys. Diana's face tightened, her composure slipping for the first time. The judge leaned forward. I find no evidence of exploitation or undue influence. On the contrary, the evidence suggests Ms. Carter and her daughter have contributed significantly to Mr. Whitmore's well-being. This case is dismissed. Relief crashed over Rachel in a wave so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. Lila let out a delighted laugh, running to hug Anthony's legs. Eleanor's eyes shone with tears she didn't bother to hide. Outside, the cameras swarmed, but for once the headlines would not be cruel. They would tell the story of a man who walked again, and of the two people who taught him how to live. The victory in court hit the community like a sudden change in weather. For weeks, Anthony's name had been whispered with suspicion. Now those same voices spoke it with reluctant admiration. The tabloids, once ruthless, plastered his photograph on the front page under headlines like, "The miracle that walked into his life." Rachel noticed the shift almost immediately. Neighbors who once turned away now paused to greet her at the market. A bouquet of white lilies appeared at the mansion gate with a note. We were wrong. Lila's school teacher asked if she could share the miracle story with her class. Inside the mansion, the air felt lighter. Anthony moved more freely each day, trading his wheelchair for a cane, his silence for conversation. In the evenings, he and Rachel would sit in the garden while Lila played, the snow melting into patches of green beneath the first touch of spring. It was on one of those evenings that Anthony spoke. Rachel, he began, his voice low but certain, I've been given back more than my legs. You've given me my life, and I don't want to imagine a day without you or Lila in it. Rachel looked at him, her breath caught between surprise and something deeper. Anthony pushed himself up from the bench, slowly, steadily, and went down on one knee. The movement was still awkward, but the determination in his eyes was unshakable. Will you marry me? He asked. For a moment, Rachel could only stare. All the years of struggle, of fighting to be seen and respected, seemed to converge into this single point in time. Lila ran over, sensing the moment, her small hands clasped in excitement. Rachel smiled through the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, Anthony. 1,000 times yes." Eleanor, who had been watching quietly from the patio, felt her own throat tighten. She stepped forward, embracing them both. "I was wrong," she admitted softly, "and I will spend the rest of my days making it right." That night, laughter filled the Whitmore mansion in a way it hadn't for decades. Not because the world outside had changed completely, but because inside these walls they had chosen to write a new story, one built on trust, love, and the courage to begin again. The wedding day arrived under a sky so clear it felt like a blessing. Guests filled the old stone church, neighbors, old colleagues, even a few who had once whispered behind closed doors. There were no sidelong glances now, only smiles and the rustle of spring flowers being passed hand to hand. Lila stood proudly at the front, scattering petals along the aisle, her white dress fluttering with each step. She glanced back often, her eyes glowing as Anthony entered, walking steadily, cane in hand, beside Rachel, whose gown was simple yet radiant. Every step they took together was more than a procession. It was proof. Proof that kindness can grow in the most unlikely soil. Proof that trust can rebuild what years of loneliness have torn down. Eleanor sat in the front row, tears glistening as she watched her son and the woman she had once doubted. When Anthony reached the altar, he turned to the gathered crowd. "I thought the greatest miracle of my life would be walking again," he said, "but I see now. That was only part of it. The real miracle was learning to see past my own walls, to fight for people the world told me didn't belong here, and to be loved in return. I once let pride and prejudice paralyze my soul more than any injury ever could. Rachel, Lila, you gave me my life back. You gave me family." Rachel's hand tightened in his. "And you gave us a place to belong. You showed us that some doors, once opened, never close again." The vows were simple, but every word was soaked in truth. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause was thunderous, because this was more than a union. It was a community's quiet admission that it had been wrong. Outside, under a shower of petals, people embraced them. Even Margaret Ellison, the neighbor whose cutting remark had once pierced Rachel, leaned in to say, "I was blind. Thank you for proving me wrong." That evening, the Whitmore mansion glowed with music and laughter. Lila darted from guest to guest, telling anyone who would listen about the day our family became official. And in the garden, Anthony and Rachel stood side by side watching her. "This is what we fought for," Rachel whispered. Anthony nodded, "and it was worth every step." The message is simple. Love has the power to dismantle prejudice. Trust can mend even the deepest fractures, and the courage to stand together can change not just a life, but a community. If this story touched you, let it remind you that miracles are often the people who walk into your life when you least expect them. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, of hope, courage, and the human heart, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe, and join us for the next story, because the miracles we share today may be the ones someone needs tomorrow.